The morning Timothy Ellsworth walked into the rocking bunkhouse with a face like carved stone. Every man at that table knew better than to ask him what was wrong, because the answer had been the same for 3 years running, and none of them had the stomach for it anymore. It was the spring of 1882, out on the high plains of the Texas Panhandle, where the wind never truly stopped, and the sky went on so long in every direction that a man could lose himself in it if he wasn't careful. The Rocking Ranch stretched across 12,000 acres of pale grass and hard earth, owned by a stubborn old rancher named Dale Holt, who had carved the place out of nothing with his bare hands, and a stubbornness that bordered on religious conviction. Dale had 16 hands working for him through the busy season, and Timothy Ellsworth had been one of them going on 6 years now, which made him the longest-standing cowhand on the property, and the one the others looked to when things went sideways. Timothy was 31 years old, broad across the shoulders, with dark brown hair that had gone a little long around the ears because he'd been too preoccupied all winter to ride into town for a cut. His jaw was square, and his eyes were the color of creek water after a rain, a kind of green-gray that could look almost blue in certain light. He was not the handsomest man on the ranch, but there was something about the way he carried himself, quiet and certain and unhurried, that made people pay attention when he spoke. The trouble was, he didn't speak much anymore. He hadn't smiled since the year the river flooded. That was how the other hands put it among themselves, quietly, when Timothy was out of earshot. The year the river flooded. The Cimarron had risen in the spring of 1879 with a ferocity that nobody in 3 counties had anticipated. The rains had come in March and kept coming, soaking the ground until it couldn't hold another drop, and then the river had climbed its banks and spread itself wide and swallowed everything in the lowlands. Timothy's small homestead had been one of the first things the water took. He'd been out on a drive when it happened. By the time he rode back, everything was gone. The cabin, the outbuildings, the 2 horses he'd left in the paddock, and most importantly, the woman he'd left inside. Her name had been Clara, and they'd been married only 8 months. She had been trying to get to higher ground, the neighbors said afterward, but the water had come too fast, and she'd been 8 months along with their first child, and she hadn't made it to the ridge in time. Timothy had not cried about it in front of anyone. He'd gone very still for about a week, and then he'd gone back to work, and he'd been going back to work ever since, every single day, with a face that gave nothing away and eyes that were always looking just past whatever was in front of him. The other hands respected his grief the way you respected a dangerous thing, carefully, from a distance. So when Dale Holt rode into the yard one cold Tuesday morning in April of 1882 and announced that his cousin's daughter was coming to help run the household through the summer, there was a general feeling of low-level curiosity among the men. The Holt house was managed by a weathered woman named Berta who'd been cooking and cleaning for Dale for 15 years, but Berta had hurt her knee coming down off the porch in February, and she wasn't getting around well enough to do the full work of the house. Dale needed help. His cousin in Kansas had a daughter who needed a fresh start. It seemed like a reasonable arrangement to everyone involved. Her name was Stella Carver, and she arrived on the Thursday stage from Amarillo. Timothy happened to be the one Dale sent to meet her, which was a small irony that the other hands appreciated more than they let on. Dale had a habit of sending Timothy to do the dignified errands because Timothy was reliable and clean and could hold a conversation without embarrassing the ranch. Timothy took the buckboard into town without comment, tied up outside the stage office, and leaned against the hitching post with his arms folded, watching the street with the patient, absent expression he wore most of the time now. The stage came in on schedule, which was unusual enough to be worth remarking on. It rolled in from the east in a cloud of red dust, and the driver climbed down and started throwing luggage off the roof, and then the door opened and Stella Carver stepped out. She was 26 years old, which Timothy would not learn until later. What he noticed first was that she was not what he'd expected, though he hadn't consciously expected anything. She was medium height, with dark hair that she'd pinned up under a plain brown traveling hat, and she had the kind of face that didn't announce itself all at once but grew more interesting the longer you looked at it. Her eyes were dark brown and direct. Her dress was simple and a little travel-worn. She had a carpet bag in one hand and a small wooden box under the other arm, and she stepped down from the stage onto the dusty street and looked around with an expression that was calm and assessing and not the least bit overwhelmed. She spotted Timothy before he pushed himself off the hitching post, because she'd been looking for someone from the ranch, and he was the most likely candidate in sight. "You'd be from the Rocking H," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am, Timothy Ellsworth. I drive for Mr. Holt." Stella Carver. She shifted the wooden box under her arm and offered her right hand, which surprised him slightly. Most women didn't shake hands, at least not in his experience. He shook it anyway. Her grip was firm. "There's one trunk on the roof," she said, already turning to look up at the driver who was still negotiating with the baggage. "The one with the red strap." Timothy got the trunk down and loaded it into the back of the buckboard without asking for help, and Stella climbed up onto the bench without waiting for assistance, which was the second thing that surprised him. He climbed up himself and turned the horses, and they started out of town, and the silence that settled between them was comfortable enough that neither of them felt the need to fill it immediately. "About a mile out," Stella said. "How far is the ranch?" "About 7 miles. Road's not bad once you get past the creek crossing." "Is the creek running high?" "Not right now. We've had a dry spring." She nodded and looked out at the countryside, and Timothy drove, and they didn't say much else for the next half hour. When the Rocking H came into view, with its big main house and the cluster of outbuildings and the long, low bunkhouse to the north, Stella looked at it with a thoughtful expression. "It's bigger than I expected," she said. "Mr. Holt has done well for himself. So I hear." She paused. "He was kind to offer this to me." Timothy said nothing to that. He wasn't sure what kind of offer it was, exactly, or what Stella's situation had been back in Kansas. Dale hadn't shared the details, and Timothy hadn't asked. Berta met them at the door of the main house, moving slowly with her bad knee but smiling genuinely, and she took Stella's arm and walked her inside, and Timothy drove the buckboard around to the barn and unloaded the trunk and went back to work. That was the end of his first encounter with Stella Carver, and he thought nothing particular about it, except that she seemed capable, and that was probably all that mattered. The Rocking H hands ate their meals in the bunkhouse, which had a long table that seated 20 and a kitchen corner where whoever was lowest on the seniority list did the cooking. The main house had a separate kitchen and dining room for Dale, and that was where Berta and Stella worked. But occasionally, when something special was needed, or when Berta's knee was particularly troublesome, Stella would bring things over to the bunkhouse or come to check on what was needed. The first time Stella appeared in the bunkhouse doorway, 3 of the hands immediately straightened up and one of them knocked over his coffee cup. Timothy noticed this without reacting to it. He was at the far end of the table, cleaning the mechanism of his rifle, which he'd spread out on a cloth at the end near the window. Stella asked about provisions. Pete Gibbons, who was nominally in charge of supplies, gave her the rundown. She thanked him, made note of it, and left. The conversation that followed her departure was the kind of conversation men have when they are trying to seem like they are not discussing what they are very obviously discussing. Timothy put his rifle back together and said nothing. The days settled into a rhythm. The spring roundup was underway, which meant everyone was up before dawn and out on the range and back after dark and too tired to make much trouble. The bunkhouse meals were utilitarian and sustaining. The work was hard and physical, and Timothy was good at it in the unthinking, automated way he'd become good at everything since the flood. He moved through his days with competence and no particular joy. Then, on a Wednesday morning in the second week after Stella had arrived, something happened that nobody at the Rocking H would forget for a long time. Berta's knee had given out completely the evening before. She'd woken up unable to put weight on it, and Dale had already sent for the doctor from town, but the doctor wouldn't arrive until afternoon. Berta was sensible enough to stay in bed, and Stella had been up since 4 in the morning managing the main house kitchen and getting Dale his breakfast and dealing with everything Berta normally did. By 7 o'clock, she'd run out of a specific coffee she needed, and the pantry in the main house was missing the salt pork that was supposed to be there. And Dale, preoccupied with a letter he'd gotten from a land agent, had suggested she go check the bunkhouse stores. So Stella came to the bunkhouse at 7 in the morning, while all 16 hands were sitting at the long table, eating the breakfast that Ruddy Salcedo had managed to cobble together, which was mostly burned biscuits and coffee that had been sitting since 5 and was approaching the consistency of river mud. The conversation at the table was, at that particular moment, about a horse. Specifically, it was about a horse that belonged to a man named Cord Whitfield, who was the most vocal and least self-aware member of the Rocking H's crew. Cord was 28 large, and had a tendency to tell the same stories multiple times without realizing it. He'd been going on for about 10 minutes about his horse, whose name was General and who had, according to Cord, performed some feat of remarkable equine intelligence that morning in the paddock. Most of the men were listening with the polite vacancy that long familiarity produces. Timothy was at his usual spot at the far end, eating his burned biscuit and looking out the window at nothing. Stella came in through the side door, which was the door closest to the storage corner, and she was moving with purpose and clearly focused on finding the salt pork and not on the conversation at the table. But the table was unavoidable long as it was, and she had to pass along the back of it to get to the storage shelves. Cord was at the peak of his story. He'd gotten to the part where General, his magnificent horse, had apparently figured out how to open the paddock gate by lifting the latch with his nose, and he was describing this with the reverence of a man recounting a miracle. "I am telling you," Cord said, slapping the table, "that horse is smarter than half the men in this room." And without pausing, without even fully turning from the shelves she was examining, without any apparent intention of joining the conversation at all, Stella Carver said, clearly and without inflection, "Only half." The bunkhouse went completely silent, and then Timothy Ellsworth at the far end of the table made a sound that nobody in that room had heard in 3 years. He laughed. It wasn't a big laugh. It wasn't the kind of laugh that shook the rafters. It was short, a single exhaled note of genuine, unguarded amusement, and it was gone almost before it arrived. But every man at that table heard it, and every man at that table turned to look at him, and the expression on Timothy Ellsworth's face in that one unguarded moment was something none of them had a name for, because they hadn't seen anything like it on his face in so long that they'd forgotten it was possible. He caught himself almost immediately. The expression shuddered. He looked back down at his plate, but for 1 second, just one, he had been there. Actually there, not the distant, hollow version of himself that had been moving through their days for 3 years. Stella had found the salt pork. She tucked it under her arm, nodded generally at the table, and walked back out the door. She hadn't heard the laugh, or if she had, she hadn't registered it. The whole bunkhouse stared at the spot where Timothy was sitting, and then they looked at each other and nobody said a word. Cord Whitfield, whose story had been so comprehensively demolished, looked around at his audience, then looked at the door Stella had just left through and shook his head slowly. "Well," he said finally, "I suppose she's got a point." The laughter that broke out then was general and relieved, the kind of laughter that comes after a long tension releases, and Timothy sat in it quietly with his eyes on his plate and did not look up, but his jaw was a little less set than it usually was, and the line between his brows had eased slightly, and those small things were, to the men who had watched him for years, as significant as a sunrise. That day out on the range, nobody mentioned it. That was the code. You didn't press Timothy Ellsworth about feelings. You let things be what they were. But there was something different in the air, a faint electricity, a sense that something had shifted, the way the air changes just before rain. Timothy worked hard that day, harder even than usual, which was saying something. He drove cattle across 3 miles of open range, repaired a section of fencing that had gone down in the night, and didn't take his full noon break. He was doing what he always did when something got under his defenses. He worked until he was so tired that thinking became impossible. But he couldn't entirely stop the thought that came to him in the afternoon, riding along the eastern pasture fence with the sun hot on his back. The thought was simple and alarming, and he tried to set it aside and found that he couldn't. He had laughed. He had actually laughed. He hadn't done that in 3 years. He didn't know what to do with that information, so he put it somewhere out of the way and left it there, and rode back to the ranch as the sun was going down, and took care of his horse, and went to supper, and did not think about Stella Carver. He thought about her the entire time. The weeks that followed were an education in noticing things. Timothy had spent 3 years not noticing things, or rather, noticing only what was immediately practical and useful. He noticed fencing that needed repair and cattle that were losing weight and whether rain was coming. He did not notice people, not in the rich, detailed way he once had. He had turned that part of himself off because it hurt less. Stella was making it difficult to keep off. She was, he discovered through unavoidable proximity, extraordinarily competent. This was the thing he noticed first because it was the least dangerous thing to notice. She had reorganized the main house pantry within her first week in a way that cut Berta's time in half, which Berta, once her knee was better, acknowledged with genuine respect rather than the territorial irritation you might expect. She kept accurate account of all the provisions for both the main house and the bunkhouse without being asked. She had, apparently, some bookkeeping experience, because Dale started having her look over his account books after the first month, and he mentioned to Timothy once, in passing, that she'd found 3 months of billing errors that had been costing him money he hadn't even known he was losing. She could also ride, which was not common for women in household positions. She didn't ride with the hands, that would have been unusual, but she rode the perimeter of the kitchen garden on the small bay mare that Dale kept for light use, and she sat the horse with the easy confidence of someone who'd grown up doing it. What Timothy noticed second, and tried harder not to notice, was that she was funny. Not in the showy way that some people were funny, not in the way that required an audience or a build-up. She was funny the way some landscapes were beautiful, effortlessly, as a function of simply being what she was. She said dry, precise things that landed without warning, and she never seemed to be fishing for a reaction. The comment in the bunkhouse had been characteristic. He was learning. She said true things plainly, and sometimes the truth was hilarious. He started to watch for it, which made him feel simultaneously ridiculous and something else he wasn't ready to name. In the 4th week of May, there was a situation with the supply wagon that threw them together more directly than before. The regular supply run to Amarillo was supposed to be handled by a hand named Jasper, but Jasper had gotten his hand caught in a winch 2 days before and had 3 fingers splinted. Timothy was the next reliable choice, and the supply run was a 2-day trip, which meant an overnight in town and a return the following afternoon. Dale also needed someone to go to the dry goods and fabric merchant on behalf of the household, to pick up specific items that Berta had ordered, and that needed to be collected from the back of the store where they'd been held. Berta gave the list to Stella, because Stella knew exactly what had been ordered and would know if something was wrong or missing. Which was how Timothy Ellsworth and Stella Carver ended up on the supply buckboard together, heading toward Amarillo on a warm May morning with a day and a half of travel between them and the ranch. They were about 4 miles out when Stella said, "You can stop being careful around me." Timothy looked at her. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Yes, you are." She said it without any heat or accusation. She was looking at the road ahead. "You've been watching me from the other side of whatever room we're in for a month now, and whenever I get close enough to have an actual conversation, you find something urgent to do. It's all right. I understand why. But it's going to make this trip very long if we're keeping that up all the way to Amarillo and back. He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved steadily ahead. The grass on either side of the road was spring green and the sky was enormous and pale blue. I'm not trying to be rude, he said. I know that. I said I understood why. She paused. Dale told me about your wife, about the flood. He felt the familiar closing down sensation, the internal shuddering, and he let it come, and then he made a deliberate decision and held it back, which surprised him as much as anything had surprised him in recent memory. He talks too much, Timothy said. He cares about you. That's what it looked like to me. Another silence, but it was easier than the ones before it. The buckboard rolled on. A red-tailed hawk made a wide circle above the road and then lifted on a thermal and disappeared. How long have you been on the ranch? Stella asked. 6 years. You like it. I like the work. That's not the same thing as liking the ranch. He thought about that. No, he said. I suppose it's not. He drove for a moment. I did like it before. It was the kind of place I thought I'd stay forever. And now it's just the place I am. She nodded slowly, as if that answer meant something to her. I understand that too, she said. He glanced at her. She was looking at the road again, her profile composed and quiet. What are you running from? He asked, and then was immediately startled by his own directness. But she didn't flinch. My husband, she said simply. Or rather, my nearly husband. I was engaged for 2 years to a man in Ellsworth, Kansas. He turned out to be the kind of man you don't discover until you're close enough that the discovery is dangerous. I got out. She paused. Dale's cousin, my mother's sister, wrote to tell Dale, and Dale offered the position. So here I am. He hurt you. Tried to. She said it flatly, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who has processed a thing thoroughly and arrived at the far side of it. I was faster than he expected. Timothy felt something sharp and protective move through him, which he noted and filed and said nothing about. Is he likely to follow? He's not the type to chase something he can't charm into compliance. Once I stopped being charming back, his interest faded. She said it without bitterness. I was more useful to him as a social asset than as an actual person. Once I removed the social usefulness, I stopped mattering. His loss, Timothy said, and then felt himself color slightly because he had not meant to say that out loud. Stella turned and looked at him. Her expression was not teasing exactly, but there was something amused and warm in it that made his collar feel too tight. That's possibly the most forthcoming thing you've said to anyone in a month, she said. I'm not usually forthcoming. I know. That's what made it notable. She turned back to the road, and there was a small smile on her face that she wasn't hiding. Thank you, Timothy. He did not say you're welcome because his voice seemed to have gone temporarily off duty. He looked at the road between the horse's ears and drove, and inside his chest, something that had been frozen and still for 3 years gave a single, tentative, tectonic shift. Amarillo was a busy town in 1882, sitting fat and commercially vital on the high plains, a hub for the cattle trade and the railroad. And when Timothy drove the buckboard in through the main street, it was the usual organized chaos of drovers and merchants and horses, and the noise of a town doing active business. He got the buckboard settled at the livery, and they separated, Stella to the dry goods and fabric merchant, Timothy to the feed and supply warehouse. They agreed to meet at the Comanche Hotel, where Dale kept an account for exactly these occasions, for supper. Timothy spent 3 hours moving through the supply warehouse with a list and a methodical precision that left no room for distraction. He arranged for the loaded wagon to be kept secured overnight at the livery. He checked on the horses. He did everything that needed doing, and then he went back to the hotel, cleaned the travel dust off himself as best he could with the basin and pitcher in the small room the hotel provided, and went down to the dining room. Stella was already there, sitting at a table near the window, and she had changed her dress. It was still simple, a dark green cotton with small buttons up the front, but it was fresher than the travel dress, and it suited her very well. She'd let some of her hair down too, not all of it, but enough that it softened the line of her face. Timothy sat down across from her, and they ordered their supper, and the conversation that followed over that meal was the first real conversation he'd had with anyone in longer than he could calculate. She told him about Kansas, about growing up in a large family with a widowed father who ran a hardware store and needed all his children to be useful before they were tall enough to see over the counter. She had 3 brothers, all married now, all still in Kansas. She'd wanted something different, she said, though she wasn't sure what she'd meant by different, only that the sameness of home had started to feel like walls closing in. She'd thought Nathaniel Greer, the man she'd almost married, was the different thing she'd been looking for. She'd been wrong. "What was it that finally told you?" Timothy asked. She was quiet for a moment, turning her fork over in her fingers. "He corrected me in front of his friends," she said finally. "Not once. Repeatedly. And when I said I found it unkind, he told me I was too sensitive and that I needed to learn how to take correction gracefully." She set the fork down. "I was 24 years old and I had been running my father's books since I was 16, and I had never in my life needed a man to correct me in public to improve my character. So I gave him back his ring." She paused. "And then I left town before he could decide how he felt about that." "Smart," Timothy said. "Self-preserving," she corrected gently. "I'm not going to dress it up as anything braver than it was." "Most people don't even manage self-preserving," he said. "They stay because staying is easier than leaving. You left. That takes something." She looked at him across the table with a direct, measuring look, the kind she gave when she was taking someone seriously. "You're different when you're not at the ranch," she said. "AMI, you talk more, or maybe you think out loud more. Either way, it's different." He considered that. "I know those men," he said. "I know what they expect of me. Here I'm just a man at a table." "I like just a man at a table," Stella said. She said it simply, not flirtatiously, just as a statement of truth. But it landed somewhere warm in him and stayed there. They finished supper. The evening had gone dark, and the hotel dining room was lit with oil lamps, and the small chink of glasses and low conversation gave the room a quality of closeness that was very different from the open spaces of the ranch. They sat for a while longer than was strictly necessary, talking about small things, the way the spring roundup was going, what she thought of the Texas landscape compared to Kansas, the particular stubbornness of Dale Holt's bookkeeping system. When she finally said good night and went upstairs to her room, Timothy sat at the table for a few more minutes with his coffee going cold in front of him. He was aware, with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable in its newness, that he had spent 2 hours at supper not thinking about Clara. Not in the hollow, self-punishing way that usually characterized his evenings. He had simply been present in the conversation, present in the room, present with Stella. He didn't know if that was a betrayal or a mercy. He sat with the uncertainty for a long time, and then he went to bed, and in the morning they drove back to the ranch. June arrived, and with it the full heat of the Texas summer, a dry, pressing heat that turned the grass gold and made the horizon shimmer and drove everyone to the shade during the hottest part of the afternoon. The cattle needed more water management. The hands worked longer days and shorter midday shifts. The pace of the ranch adjusted itself to the season with a naturalness that was one of the things Timothy had always found settling about this kind of life. It moved with the land, not against it. He and Stella had settled into something that could be called a friendship, carefully and without much discussion. They talked in the mornings when he came to check on the supply list. They talked in the evenings sometimes, on the porch of the main house when the day was done and the heat had backed off enough to breathe. She brought things to the bunkhouse twice a week, and there was always a brief exchange between them, nothing that anyone could point to. But the other hands had noticed the way Timothy turned slightly toward the door when he heard her coming. Pete Gibbons, who had 20 years of watching people behind him and had therefore become something of an expert in human behavior, said to Ruddy Salcedo quietly one evening, "He's coming back." Ruddy looked up from his boot he was resoling. "You think?" "I think," Pete said. They said nothing else about it. That was the code. On a Saturday evening in June, Dale Holt hosted a small gathering at the main house. It was a thing he did occasionally in the summer, inviting the neighboring ranch families and the minister and the schoolteacher and one or two businessmen from town for a supper and some music afterward. Berta and Stella spent 2 days preparing for it. The hands were expected to be presentable, which meant clean shirts and the better hats, and to behave themselves if the gathering spilled out onto the porch and yard, which it usually did. Timothy put on his better shirt and his clean hat and attended, because Dale expected it, and because he had been attending these gatherings for 6 years out of obligation. He stood near the fence of the kitchen garden with a glass of the lemonade Stella had made, watching the gathering with the patient, slightly remote expression he wore in social situations. Stella moved through the evening as though she'd been doing this her whole life. She refilled glasses and made small conversation and laughed at the appropriate moments and kept the food coming from the kitchen with the quiet efficiency that characterized everything she did. She was wearing a light blue dress that evening, the nicest he'd seen her in, and her hair was up properly, and more than one of the visiting men looked at her twice. One of them was a fellow named Arthur Baines, who ran a smaller ranch about 10 miles east, and who was, by most accounts, a perfectly decent man in his mid-30s, a widower of 2 years who had started making his way back into the social world, with the cautious optimism of a man who had decided that life was going to continue whether he liked it or not. Arthur was tall and had a pleasant face and good manners, and he talked to Stella for a long stretch of the evening with what was clearly more than polite interest. Timothy watched this. He watched it from his spot by the kitchen garden fence with a stillness that was different from his usual stillness, a stillness with something clenched beneath it, and he watched Arthur Baines make Stella laugh twice, and he watched Stella's face when she laughed, open and genuine, and something happened in him that he recognized despite not having felt it in a very long time. Jealousy was a word too simple for it. It was more like a clarity, like looking at something in sudden, unambiguous light. It was the feeling that told him, without preamble or ceremony, that he cared what happened to Stella Carver in a way that had moved several latitudes beyond simple neighborly interest. He did not act on this. He stood by the fence and finished his lemonade and eventually moved inside when the music started because the fiddle player was good and music was one of the few things that could still find him reliably. He stood in the doorway and listened, and at some point Stella appeared at his elbow between tasks and stood listening too. "You like music," she said. "I always have. You look different listening to it." He glanced at her. "How do I look?" she considered. "Present," she said carefully. "You look like you're actually somewhere." The fiddle played on. Outside, the summer night was warm and full of crickets. "I used to play," Timothy said. He hadn't said that to anyone in years. He wasn't sure why he said it now. "Guitar, not well." "What happened to it?" "The flood took it." A small silence. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it, he could tell, in the specific way she'd meant it and not the general polite way. She was sorry about the guitar itself as a thing lost, not just sorry as a social formality. "I haven't thought about the guitar in a while," he said, and it was true. Just now, listening, he paused. "It's strange, the things you forget you've lost." She was quiet beside him for a moment. The music shifted to something slower. "The things you're allowed to stop mourning," she said softly, "are not the same things as the things you've actually stopped loving. You can still love a thing without carrying the grief of it every day." He turned and looked at her fully. She was looking at the fiddle player, her profile lit by the oil lamp light, and she hadn't said it for effect. She'd said it the way she said most things because it was true and it needed saying. He thought about Clara. He thought about the guitar. He thought about 3 years of moving through days like they were weather to be survived rather than a life to be lived. "That's a generous way to think about it," he said. "It's the only useful way." She glanced at him then briefly and then away. "Grief is like a river. It carves its shape into you, but you don't have to stand in it all the time." He stood very still for a moment, and then he said, "Would you like to walk outside? It's cooler." She looked at him with a slight lift of surprise, quickly covered. "Yes," she said, "I would." They walked out onto the far side of the porch, away from the main cluster of the gathering, and stood at the porch rail looking out at the dark plain. The stars were extraordinary out here, the kind of stars you never got near a city, a whole blazing architecture of them thrown across the sky in a density that took your breath if you let it. "I keep forgetting they're like this," Stella said, looking up. "I was too far east before." "The sky's different out here," Timothy agreed. "Everything's different out here. The sky, the ground, the way sound travels. I never fully understood it when I first came out. I'd spent my life in wooded country. Nothing prepared me for this much open. Did it take long to love it?" he thought. "About a year, and then I couldn't imagine being anywhere else." She nodded, and he could see something in the line of her face that spoke of a recognition, of someone in the early stages of exactly that same falling. They stayed out there until the gathering started to wind down, talking about the land and the sky and the particular quality of silence that the Panhandle had at night, a silence so wide and deep that it almost had a sound of its own. They did not talk about anything personal or weighted or significant, but the fact of standing there together, in the dark, on the edge of that enormous sky, was itself a kind of intimacy that Timothy had not allowed himself in a very long time. When she went back inside to help clear the supper things, she paused at the door and turned back briefly. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" She smiled, and it was the first time he'd been on the direct receiving end of that smile from close up, and it was, he decided, a remarkable thing, warm and honest and unperformed. "For the stars," she said, and went inside. He stood at the porch rail for a long time after that. The following morning he went to Pete Gibbons, who was the closest thing he had to a confidant on the ranch, and said, without preamble, "I need to go to town." Pete looked up from the harness he was working. "Today." "Tomorrow, Saturday. We've got fence work Saturday." "I know, I'll go Sunday then." Pete looked at him with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who has watched over a friend for a long time and knows when something has changed. "All right," he said. "Sunday." Timothy went to town on Sunday and spent 40 minutes in the music and general goods store, which sold instruments alongside tools and household items. He came back with a guitar. It was not fancy, a plain spruce-top instrument in good condition, with a clear, round tone when he plucked the strings in the store to check them. It was the first thing he'd bought for purely personal reasons in 3 years. He spent 3 evenings relearning it, quietly in the corner of the bunkhouse after the other men had gone to sleep, working through the shapes his fingers remembered better than his mind did, the muscle memory of it coming back in pieces, like a language half forgotten. On the 4th evening, Pete Gibbons, who had clearly been awake and listening, said from his bunk without turning over, "You're getting there." "Shut up," Timothy said, but there was something in his voice that had not been there before. Something that sounded faintly like the possibility of humor. Pete didn't say anything else. He just smiled at the wall. Word got around the bunkhouse, the way everything got around the bunkhouse eventually. By the end of that second week, 3 or 4 of the hands would sometimes stay awake to listen when Timothy played in the evenings, and nobody made a big deal about it, and Timothy pretended not to notice their quiet company. And it was the most comfortable and human thing that had happened in that bunkhouse in a long time. Stella heard about the guitar from Berta, who heard about it from Dale, who had been told by Pete Gibbons when Pete was bringing in the morning supply list. One morning when Timothy came to check on provisions, Stella handed him the list and then said, with studied casualness, "I hear you're playing again." He took the list. "Word travels. Out here it does." A pause. "I'm glad." He folded the list. He wanted to say something, not about the guitar, but something. He wasn't quite sure what. "I'm working up to playing for an audience," he said instead, which was as close as he could get. Her eyes were warm and quiet on him. "I'll look forward to that," she said. The summer deepened. The heat grew more serious, the kind that turned the land to a memory of its wetter self and made the cattle restless and the horses short-tempered and the men irritable. There was always more work than there were hours in the day, and Timothy threw himself into it with the same driven energy he'd always brought to labor, but it was different now. He was not running from something. He was slowly in the cautious and uncertain way of a man who has been hurt and is choosing to try again anyway, running towards something. He asked Stella, one evening in late July, if she would sit with him while he played. She came out to the south porch of the main house, where Dale's older rocking chairs were set in the shade, and she sat in one of them and Timothy sat in the other, and he played for about an hour. He played the things he remembered, old songs, hymns his mother had liked, a couple of dance tunes that the ranch hands had brought from various corners of the country. He was not perfect. His fingers made mistakes. But the tone was true and the feeling in it was genuine. And Stella sat and listened with her hands folded in her lap, and a quality of attention that made him feel, in a way he hadn't in years, that what he was doing was worth doing. When he stopped, she said, "Play that second one again, the slow one." He played it again. When it ended, she was quiet for a moment. "My mother used to sing that," she said. "Not those words, different words, but that melody." "I don't know the words to this version," he admitted. "I just know the tune." "Neither do I really, just fragments." She hummed a few bars of it quietly, and he picked it up on the guitar, following her, and they went back and forth like that for a few minutes, her humming and him playing, until they found the shape of something together that felt like it belonged to neither of them and both of them equally. That was the evening he knew, completely and without any ambiguity remaining, that he was in love with her. He didn't say it. He was not ready to say it. There was still a part of him that was afraid of the saying of it, afraid of what it meant, afraid of the ways in which love had the capacity to be taken from you without warning. But he knew, and the knowing itself was a kind of relief, like finally finding firm ground after a long stretch of waiting. In August, there was trouble. It came from an unexpected direction. A letter arrived for Stella, and Timothy saw her face after she read it, and he knew before she said anything that whatever it contained was bad. She came to find him, which told him something important about how things had shifted between them. She didn't go to Dale or Berta. She came to the paddock where Timothy was working with a young horse that was proving resistant to saddle training. "The letter is from my brother Henry," she said, standing at the paddock fence with the letter in her hand. "He says Nathaniel Greer has been asking after me, in Ellsworth, making inquiries about where I went." Timothy stopped working with the horse. "Asking who?" "Henry, our father's shop. Neighbors." Her voice was steady, but her knuckles on the fence post were not. "Henry says he doesn't think Nathaniel would come out here. He's a town man." "But he thought I should know." Timothy came to the fence and stood on the other side of it. "What do you think? Would he come?" "I don't know." A pause. "Nathaniel doesn't like losing things, even things he doesn't want. It's a pride matter." "Then we tell Dale," Timothy said. "I don't want to worry Dale over Stella." He said her name with a quiet, particular firmness. "We tell Dale. He needs to know if someone might come onto his land looking for one of his people. That's not a burden. That's information he would want." She looked at him for a moment, then she nodded. They told Dale that evening. Dale, whose experience of the world was extensive and whose protectiveness of his people was genuine, took it seriously without being dramatic about it. He made a few arrangements. He let the hands know, in broad terms, that a man from Kansas might show up with questions, and that the man was not to be pointed in any direction. He sent word to the local sheriff in town. He was quiet and practical about it, which was the most reassuring possible response. Timothy took on extra patrol of the ranch perimeter over the following weeks without being asked, rising an hour earlier to ride the outer fence lines before the rest of the work began. He said nothing about it to anyone. He just did it. Nathaniel Greer never came. Whether he lost interest or lost courage or simply moved on to some other preoccupation, he never materialized at the Rocking H or in the nearest town. By September, the tension had mostly faded, replaced by the straightforward demands of the fall season and the preparations for winter. But Stella knew about the early morning rides. Pete Gibbons had mentioned it to Ruddy, who had mentioned it to Berta, who had mentioned it to Stella, because that was how information traveled on the ranch, in an unbroken and unstoppable chain of human concern. She came to find Timothy one morning when he was coming in from the early ride, unsaddling his horse in the barn. "You've been riding the fence lines," she said. He didn't look up from the cinch he was working. "Fences need checking, before dawn every day for 3 weeks." He pulled the saddle off and set it on the stand. "It's a good time before the heat." She was quiet for a moment, standing in the barn doorway with the early morning light coming in around her. "Timothy," he turned. "Thank you," she said. Her voice had something in it that was not her usual composed steadiness. Something more open and more vulnerable. "I know what you've been doing." He looked at her for a long moment. The barn was cool and dim around them, smelling of hay and horses and saddle leather. Outside, the day was just beginning, the sky going from dark purple to the pale gold of early morning. "I'm not going to let anyone come onto this land and frighten you," he said. He said it quietly and without drama, and it was exactly the truth, no more and no less. She came into the barn then, 3 steps, and she stood close enough that he could see the detail of her face in the low light, and she put her hand on his arm briefly, warmly, and she said, "I know." He covered her hand with his for one moment, just a moment, and then she took her hand back and he took his back, and there was a breath between them that was full of everything that hadn't been said yet and everything that was about to be. "Stella," he said. "Yes. I want to tell you something, and I need you to know that I don't say it to put any kind of burden on you or to ask for anything back. I'm not very good at this anymore. I'm not sure I was ever very good at it." He was looking at her steadily, and his voice was low and serious and completely honest. "But you have been the first thing in 3 years to make me feel like I was actually living my life and not just getting through it. And I think that deserves saying out loud." She was very still. Her eyes on him were warm and dark and serious. "You laughed," she said quietly. "What?" "That morning in the bunkhouse when I came in for the salt pork." The corner of her mouth moved slightly. "I heard you. I pretended not to because I thought drawing attention to it would embarrass you, but I heard it and I have been thinking about it ever since." He blinked. "You pretended not to hear. You needed me to." He looked at her, and something in him turned over completely and settled into a new position, solid and warm and permanent feeling. "You are the most perceptive person I have ever met," he said. "And you," she said, taking another half-step closer, "are the most carefully guarded person I have ever met, but I have liked very much what I have found when the guard was down." He reached out and took her hand, properly this time, not briefly but with intention, and she let him, and they stood in the barn doorway in the early morning light with their hands linked and all the unsaid things settling themselves into a configuration that made sense. "I would like to court you," he said, "if you're willing." Properly, she looked at him with something luminous in her expression. "I think I'd like that very much," she said. Courting on a working ranch in 1882 did not look the way it did in parlors and drawing rooms. It looked like Sunday afternoons when the regular work was set aside, walking along the creek with careful propriety and talking about everything and nothing. It looked like the south porch in the evenings, Timothy with his guitar and Stella with a piece of mending or a book, and the conversation between them easy and unhurried. It looked like him lifting the heavy provisions crates she didn't need help with because he wanted to be near her, and her catching him doing it and saying with dry precision, "I am perfectly capable of lifting that myself," and him saying, "I know," and lifting it anyway, and her shaking her head but not objecting further. It looked like Dale Holt watching all of this with the poorly concealed satisfaction of a man who has set a very slow clock and is pleased to finally hear it chime. The other hands responded to the development, with the range of reactions you would expect from a group of men who had watched Timothy Ellsworth exist in a kind of suspended grief for 3 years, and who now found themselves watching him come gradually back to life. There was genuine warmth in it, expressed in the ways men on the frontier expressed warmth, which was mostly through not saying anything at all but doing things like making sure Timothy got first pick of the good horses for his Sunday ride, and ensuring that the south porch was always mysteriously clear when the evenings turned cool. Cord Whitfield, to his eternal credit, said nothing about the incident with the salt pork. He did, however, acquire a marked new appreciation for Stella's opinions on various subjects, and was frequently to be found asking her for her assessment of things, which she gave with the same candid precision she gave everything. It became, in a subtle way, the most respected opinion on the ranch. October came with the first real coolness in the air, the smell of turning grass and coming weather, and the beautiful, melancholy gold that settled over the plains when the season turned. There was a stretch of October days that were so perfect in their clarity and color that simply being outside in them felt like something you needed to remember. On one of those days, Timothy and Stella rode out together on the pretense of checking the eastern water tanks, which was perfectly legitimate ranch business, and which neither of them pointed out was also just a very good excuse to spend a few hours on horseback together across 12,000 acres of October plains. They stopped at the top of a low rise that looked out over a wide sweep of the land, the grass catching the light, a hawk turning lazy circles somewhere far out over the eastern quarter, the sky a blue so deep it was almost violet at the edges. "I keep thinking," Stella said, looking out at all of it, "that this is the different thing I was looking for. When I wanted something different, I didn't know what it was going to look like, but this is it." Timothy looked at her. She was in profile against that enormous sky, her hair coming loose in the wind, her jacket open because the afternoon was warmer than the morning had been, and she was so entirely, naturally, perfectly herself in that moment that it was almost difficult to look at directly. "The land?" he asked, though he thought he knew what she meant. "The land," she said, "and the life." And she stopped. Then she looked at him, and the directness in her eyes was complete. "You know what else?" "Tell me," he said, because he wanted to hear it. She reached across the space between their horses and took his hand. "You," she said, "obviously." He held her hand there on that rise above the golden plains for a long moment. Then he leaned across and kissed her, the first time, careful and warm and right, with the wind moving through the grass all around them and the hawk turning its slow circles far out above the world. She kissed him back. And then she pulled back slightly and looked at him, and her expression was something he was going to remember for the rest of his life. "You're smiling," she said. He was. He hadn't noticed until she said it, but he was smiling. A genuine, full, unguarded smile, the first one in 3 years, and it felt strange and right simultaneously, like a language your mouth remembers long after you've stopped speaking it. "I suppose I am," he said. She looked at him for a moment, her hand still in his, with an expression that was so full of warmth and care and something that was unmistakably love that it closed his throat for a second. "Good," she said simply. "It suits you." They rode back to the ranch in the fading afternoon light, and when they came through the gate and Pete Gibbons looked up from the water trough he was fixing, and saw the two of them come in together with an ease and a warmth that left nothing ambiguous. He looked at Ruddy, who was carrying a bucket nearby, and Ruddy looked back at Pete, and they both nodded, satisfied. November was the time of serious preparation for winter, the checking and reinforcing of structures, the stock management, the supply laying in, and it consumed everyone on the ranch in the busy, purposeful way that winter preparation always did. Timothy and Stella were both occupied with the ranch's needs, but they found their hours together, in the shorter days and the longer evenings, and what had been building through the summer and fall continued to deepen and settle into something very solid and real. Dale Holt invited Timothy into the main house study one cold November evening and offered him a whiskey, which was not the usual course of things, and Timothy sat in the chair opposite Dale's desk and waited. "I'm not a man who interferes in other people's business," Dale said. "No," Timothy agreed, "you generally are not." That said, Dale turned his glass in his hands. He was 61 years old, with a face like worn leather and eyes that missed very little. "I care about 2 people in this situation, and I'd like to know what your intentions are. As her nearest family in this part of the country, I think I've got the standing to ask." "You do," Timothy said. He considered for a moment, not because he was uncertain, but because the words mattered. "I intend to ask her to marry me if she'll have me. I wanted to speak to you first." Dale looked at him steadily. "She came here to be safe," he said. "She came here because she needed a situation that wasn't going to put her in harm's way. She's found more than that, which I'm glad of. But she deserves someone who's going to stay steady, not someone who's still in the river." "I know," Timothy said. "I won't tell you the grief is finished because I don't think grief works that way, but I can tell you that I'm not drowning in it anymore. She had something to do with that." He met Dale's eyes. "I will not waste the second chance I've been given." Dale was quiet for a moment. Then he set down his glass. "She's a very capable woman," he said. "She's the most capable person I know. She'll tell you when you're wrong. I'm counting on it." Dale nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "You have my blessing, whatever that's worth to you." "It's worth a good deal," Timothy said honestly. He asked Stella on a Sunday in late November, on the south porch in the early evening with the first real cold in the air and a thin slice of moon showing at the edge of the sky. He didn't have a ring, not yet, but he had a question, and the question was enough. He had been sitting with his guitar, playing quietly, and she had been sitting in the other chair with her shawl around her shoulders, and the evening had reached that particular quality of peace and rightness that had come to define their evenings together. He set the guitar aside and turned to face her. "Stella." She looked at him, and whatever she saw in his face made her go very still. "I know this may be quick by some measures," he said, "and I know you've had cause to be careful about men and their intentions. I don't take that lightly. But I have been falling in love with you since a Tuesday morning in April when you said something at the breakfast table that made me remember what it felt like to be alive. And I think I have been thoroughly in love with you for months now. And I would like very much, if you are willing, for you to be my wife." She sat and looked at him for a long, warm moment. The cold air moved around the porch. The thin moon held its place. "Timothy Ellsworth," she said, and her voice was completely steady and completely warm. "I have been waiting for you to get around to that for at least 2 months." He laughed. Actually laughed, open and full, and it was easy now, it came without surprise. "Is that a yes?" "That is absolutely a yes," she said, and she reached across the arm of her chair and took his hand, and he held it, and they sat together in the early winter dark, and it was the best evening either of them had spent in a very long time. They were married in January of 1883, in the small church in town, on a day that was cold and clear with a sky of that particular winter blue that belongs to the high plains like a signature. Berta cried, which she would have denied if pressed. Dale stood up for the occasion with the dignity of a man who considers himself responsible for the outcome and is not displeased. The hands from the rocking H attended in their best clothes, which they wore with the vaguely uncomfortable dignity of men who primarily live in work clothes. But they came, all of them, and when the minister pronounced the couple married, the noise from the pews was warmer and more genuine than any church greeting could have manufactured. Stella wore a dress of pale cream wool that Berta had helped her make over the previous month. Her hair was done up with small flowers that were the best winter could offer in that part of the world, sprigs of dried lavender and rosemary from the kitchen garden. She was beautiful in the way she was always beautiful, naturally, without effort or decoration, the beauty that came from being entirely herself. Timothy stood at the front of that church and watched her come down the aisle on Dale Holt's arm, and when she reached him and turned to face him, the look on his face was one that Pete Gibbons, standing in the second pew, was going to carry in his memory for the rest of his life. It was the look of a man who has come back from somewhere very far away and found, to his amazement, that home was more beautiful than he'd remembered. "Hello," Stella said quietly when she reached him. "Hello," he said. The minister said his words. They said theirs. The ring Timothy had gotten from the jeweler in Amarillo was a simple gold band, clean and solid, and when he put it on her finger it looked exactly right. After, there was a gathering at the Rocking H main house, which Dale had arranged with more thoroughness than he'd let on, including a fiddle player and enough food to feed twice the number that showed up, and a small amount of whiskey that was consumed with moderate restraint. The dancing went until late, which in winter in 1883 meant until about 9 o'clock, and Timothy played 2 songs on his guitar between the fiddle players' sets, and Stella stood listening with her wedding ring catching the lamp light, and the expression on her face watching him was precisely the thing she had told him in October, on the rise above the plains. Obviously, she had said, "You." He had a clear purpose now, and it gave his days a different quality, a direction that was not just forward through time but toward something specific. After the wedding, the question of their future arrangements was practical and immediate. Timothy had saved well over 6 years of working for Dale. A working cowhand in 1882 made modest wages but steady ones, and Timothy had modest needs, and had therefore accumulated more than most. He spoke to Dale about acquiring a small acreage adjacent to the ranch's eastern boundary, 20 acres of good grassland with access to a seasonal creek, that Dale had been carrying without particular use for 3 years. Dale sold it to him at a fair price, with the condition that Timothy stay on as his foreman, which was a promotion from his current position and came with a better wage. Timothy shook Dale's hand on both counts and went home to tell Stella. She was sitting at the kitchen table of the small house they'd been given at the west end of the ranch property, a real house, 2 rooms with a proper hearth, worlds better than the bunkhouse, and she was going through the provision accounts with the focused attention she brought to numbers. When he told her about the land, she set down the accounts and looked at him with a clear, assessing expression. 20 acres, she said. For now. For now, he agreed. And you want to run a few cattle of our own on it. In time, when the finances allow, she nodded slowly. I've been looking at the accounts, she said, tapping the paper in front of her. If we're careful through this year, by next spring we'd have enough to buy a small breeding pair and have something to build from. He sat down across from her. You've already been thinking about it. I've been thinking about it since September, she admitted. You were going to get here eventually, I just wanted to have done the preliminary work. He looked at her across the table, this woman he had married, this precise and practical and warm and funny woman, and he felt something that was simply and completely happiness. Not the old happiness which he'd lost in the flood with everything else. A new one. One that had been built out of grief and time and a Tuesday morning in April and an October day on a rise above the Golden Plains. Have I mentioned, he said, that you are remarkable? She looked up from the accounts. You have on a few occasions. I don't find it tiresome. The corner of her mouth moved. You could mention it again. You're remarkable, he said. Thank you. She returned to the accounts. Now come look at these numbers and tell me if I've made a mistake in the March column. He got up and went around to look at the March column, standing behind her with his hand on the back of her chair, and he leaned down to look at the numbers, and also, because he could now, pressed a brief kiss to the top of her head. She did not look up from the March column, but she smiled. Spring came to the Texas Panhandle the way it always did, tentatively at first, then all at once. The grass came back. The sky went through its transition from winter white to the deep, vivid blue of warm months. The Cimarron ran clear and manageable after a mild winter, nothing like the flood year, just a good healthy running river doing what a river was supposed to do. Timothy rode along its banks one March morning, doing the eastern fence line, and he stopped and looked at the water for a long time. It was just a river. It was just water doing what water does. 3 years ago, looking at it had been like looking at the face of something that had taken everything from him. Now it was just a river, moving through the country the way it always had, indifferent and beautiful and entirely natural. He sat on his horse and looked at it, and then he let it be what it was and rode on. That spring, they bought the breeding pair Stella had worked out in the accounts. 2 well-bred shorthorn cattle, a young bull and a heifer, that arrived at the Rocking H from a reputable rancher in the southern part of the territory. Timothy and Stella went to look at them together when they were brought in, and Stella walked around the heifer with the focused, assessing air she brought to everything, checking the animal's legs and coat and general condition with an expertise that Timothy had not known she possessed until this moment. You know cattle, he said. My uncle ran cattle. I spent several summers with my uncle's family. She straightened up. She's good stock. He did well. She meant the seller. She's good stock, Timothy agreed. He looked at Stella. You are endlessly full of things I don't know about you. That should keep you interested, she said briskly, but she was pleased. He could see it in the set of her shoulders. They named the heifer May for the month she arrived. The bull they named General, which caused Cord Whitfield enormous satisfaction when he found out. See, Cord said to nobody in particular. The name General, it's a great name for a bovine, I have always said so. You've said it about a horse, Pete pointed out. The principle stands, Cord said. Summer arrived, and with it 2 things of significance. The first was that the 20 acres adjacent to the ranch's eastern boundary developed a fence line that Timothy built himself, post by post, over the course of 6 weeks of early mornings and occasional Sundays. A solid fence that said here is mine in the language of the plains. It was a good fence. He was proud of it in the quiet, private way he was proud of things he built well. The second was that Stella came to him one morning in June with a look on her face that combined composure and a barely suppressed illumination, and told him she was expecting. He looked at her for a moment. He felt several things at once, including an echo of the old fear, the knowledge of what pregnancy on this land could mean, the memory of what he'd lost the last time. He let himself feel it, acknowledged it, and then he set it carefully aside because it was the past talking and the present was the woman standing in front of him with her hands folded and her dark eyes watching him with quiet certainty. "Come here," he said. She came. He put his arms around her and held on, and she held back, and they stood like that in the kitchen of their small house while the summer morning came through the windows. "We'll be careful," he said, into her hair. "We'll be sensible," she said. She pulled back to look at him. "And I want you to hear me say this now so you have it for the months ahead. I am going to be fine. I am strong and I am healthy and I am sensible and I have Berta 400 yards away and Dr. Hannigan is in town. I am going to be fine." He looked at her face. Calm, serious, warm, true. "I know," he said. "I know you are." He was afraid anyway. It would have been dishonest to pretend otherwise. But he carried the fear the way she'd taught him to carry grief, as a thing that was part of him without being all of him, without letting it crowd out the joy that was also equally true and equally real. The pregnancy was straightforward in the way that some pregnancies simply are. Stella was healthy, as she had said, and practical, as she always was, and she continued to manage the ranch accounts and the household provisions with the same thoroughness she always brought, only adding a chair at the provision table and shortening her working hours slightly as the autumn progressed. Berta fussed over her with the dedicated attention of a woman who has been waiting for something to fuss over and has found the perfect subject. Dale Holt, who had been a bachelor for the full length of his acquaintance with Timothy, looked at Stella's expanding condition with the expression of a man encountering something wonderful and being unsure how to express it, and took to bringing small, unnecessary things by the house, a jar of something from the market in town, a book he thought she might like, small offerings of care in the language he knew best, which was practical provision. On a cold night in late November, a week before the anniversary of their wedding, with the first real snow of the winter dusting the roof, their son was born. The labor was long and the night was difficult, and Timothy spent most of it in the main room of the house, because Dr. Hannigan and Berta were in the back room and he had been firmly and kindly told to wait, and so he waited. He sat by the hearth with his guitar across his lap and did not play it but held it, and he talked to Clara in his head, briefly and honestly, the way he had not done in a long time. He told her he was not forgetting her. He told her he was not replacing her. He told her that the love he had for Stella was its own thing, new and real, and not built on the ruins of the old love, but built alongside it, in the space that life kept making if you let it. He told her he hoped she understood. Then he heard the sound that changed everything, the first full-throated cry of a new person announcing itself to the world, and Berta opened the door and said, "Come in, Timothy. Come and meet your son." He came in and Stella was there, exhausted and entirely present, holding a small, red-faced, vigorously protesting infant. And when she looked up and saw Timothy, her face broke into a smile that he was going to carry for the rest of his life and some distance beyond. "He's loud," she said, "like I suspected he would be." Timothy sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, small and new and loud and perfect. He reached out a careful hand, and the infant's fingers closed around his with an automatic, trusting grip that went straight through him like light. "Hello," he said very quietly to this new person. And then, because this was a thing he wanted to say out loud and he had learned from a specific woman the value of saying true things out loud, he said, "I will take good care of you, both of you. That is not going to change." Stella reached over and put her hand on his arm, and he looked at her, and she looked at him. And the firelight in the room was warm, and the snow outside was quiet, and their son was squalling at a volume that was, honestly, impressive. "What do we call him?" Timothy asked. Stella had a clear and immediate answer. "James," she said, "for your grandfather, you told me about him." He had mentioned his grandfather once briefly in a conversation about family during one of their summer Sunday walks. She had remembered, which was so completely her that it should not have surprised him, and did anyway. "James," he said, "James Ellsworth." "James Henry Ellsworth," she said. "Henry for my brother." "James Henry Ellsworth," he agreed. "It's a good name." The baby, apparently unimpressed by his own name, continued to make his opinions known, and Berta shooed Timothy out after another few minutes to let Stella rest, and he went back to the main room and sat by the fire again. But this time he picked up the guitar and played, very softly, the slow song he and Stella had found together, the one from her mother's singing, the one that belonged to both of them equally. Outside, the snow kept falling on the Texas Panhandle, soft and quiet, covering the 20 acres along the eastern fence line and the good shorthorn cattle in the pasture, and the long stretch of the Rocking H Ranch and the road that led to town, covering everything equally and gently, the way weather did, the way time did, impartial and patient and ongoing. The winter settled in fully, and the small house was warm, and James Henry Ellsworth grew from his first furious announcement of himself into a more thoughtful observer of the world as the weeks passed, and by Christmas, he would sometimes stop crying to look up at the lamplight with an expression of profound concentration that Timothy recognized as his mother's expression, and that made him smile every single time. The ranch continued. Spring roundup came again. The 20 acres along the eastern boundary were developing into something real, something that would grow. Dale Holt spent more time in the kitchen of the small house than he did in his own dining room, which he justified to Berta on the grounds of discussing ranch business, and which everybody understood to be old Dale Holt sitting near a baby and being quietly, completely unable to resist the gravitational pull of new life. On a Sunday in April, almost exactly a year after Stella had arrived on the stage from Amarillo, Timothy sat on the south porch of the small house with his guitar and his son on his knee, James Henry being 4 months old and newly interested in the resonant sound of the strings, which he reached for with the earnest, clumsy enthusiasm of an infant discovering the world. Stella sat in the other chair, her shawl around her shoulders in the early spring chill, watching the two of them with the expression Timothy had no word for except love. "He's going to want to play," she said. "He can learn." Timothy adjusted his grip on the baby, keeping his weight from the strings. "In a few years, he'll want to learn everything all at once. He has your temperament. He has your stubbornness." "My determination," she corrected. "That's what I said." She gave him the look. He gave her the look back. James Henry, caught between two people engaged in the particular kind of marital exchange that is simultaneously argumentative and deeply affectionate, reached out and grabbed the nearest guitar string with his whole fist and produced a discordant twang, as if weighing in. They both laughed, fully, genuinely, the easy laugh of people who have found the place where they belong. The spring air moved across the porch. Somewhere in the pasture, May the Shorthorn was expecting her first calf, which Stella had correctly predicted 2 months ago on the basis of observation. The creek at the eastern boundary was running clear and mild. The rocking H was going into its 32nd year, and the grass was coming up green, and the sky was doing what the Texas Panhandle sky always did, going on forever in every direction, immense and particular and irreplaceable. "What are you thinking?" Stella asked, watching him. He looked at her and at the baby on his knee, who was now very seriously attempting to eat the guitar strap, and at the long plains running out to the horizon in the warm April morning. "I'm thinking about the bunkhouse," he said. "That Tuesday morning," she smiled slowly. "The salt pork." "The salt pork," he looked at her. "I want to tell you something. You say that often." "Because I keep thinking of things that need saying." She waited, patient and warm and entirely attentive. "I've been trying to find a word for what you did," he said. "Walking into that bunkhouse and saying what you said and walking out again without knowing what it did. I've been trying to find a word for the whole of it, for you, for what you've been to me. And I don't have a single word. What I have is this." He gestured, a small gesture that encompassed the porch and the house and the 20 acres and the baby and the guitar and the morning and all of it. "Everything I couldn't imagine when I was standing in the river." She was quiet for a moment. Her eyes were bright. "There's a word for it," she said. "What's the word?" "Home," she said simply. He looked at her across the small distance of the porch, his wife, his partner, the woman who had walked into a room of grieving, closed-down silence, and said a true thing out loud and cracked 3 years of winter open without even trying. The woman who had ridden beside him across the October plains and taken his hand and said his name. The woman who had planned his cattle operation in the accounts months before he got there himself. The woman who was looking at him right now with everything she was entirely visible in her face, offered without reservation. "Home," he said, and meant it completely. James Henry Ellsworth, expressing no interest whatsoever in any of this, had fallen asleep against his father's arm with the abrupt, total surrender of a satisfied infant, one fist still loosely curled around the guitar strap. Timothy played one-handed for a while, very softly so as not to wake the baby. The slow song, the one that belonged to both of them. Stella sat and listened with her shawl around her and her face turned to the morning, and the spring came on across the plain, and the river ran clear in its banks, and everything that had been taken, and everything that had been rebuilt, and everything that had been found in the finding of each other, settled itself into the particular and irreplaceable shape of a life that was good. The sun moved across the sky the way it always had, the way it would keep doing, bright and indifferent and beautiful, over the 12,000 acres of the rocking H and the 20 acres along the eastern fence line, and the small house with its warm hearth and its provision, accounts spread on the kitchen table, and over the man on the porch who had not smiled since the year the river flooded and who was smiling now, and over the woman beside him who had said something so simply and so precisely true that it had cracked the world open and let the light back in, and over the baby between them who had arrived to confirm that the world was, despite everything, still in the business of beginning. And that was enough. That was, in fact, everything.